Hi, and welcome to episode 12 of The Political Pulse. Today we're honoured to interview federal independent member for the seat of Curtin, Kate Chaney. We'll be talking to her about her work in federal and local politics. Welcome to the Scotch Political Pulse.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So just starting things off, what was your journey into politics? Why did you start out and what made you run as an independent?
So I had never been involved in politics before, and I'd been a lawyer. I'd worked at Boston Consulting Group in strategy consulting for big companies. I'd worked at Wesfarmers in a range of different roles around both commercial and social impact. And then in community, at Anglicare WA Community Services in strategy and innovation. And I'd always cared a lot about issues and about the future of the country, but couldn't really see myself in politics. I didn't feel like I really fit in either of the major parties, and it just seemed combative and destructive and horrible. But really felt frustrated with what I was seeing at a federal level, and felt like when I was younger, I felt really proud to be Australian, and it felt like we were moving more and more to appealing to fear rather than hope. And I was approached in January 2022 by an independent community group that was looking for to run an independent member. And I had a chat with them and we shared a lot of the same frustrations around particularly the coalition's position on climate and climate change, also on integrity issues with really declining trust in politicians, where people, I think, increasingly were thinking that the politicians were acting for vested interests rather than in the public interest. And so after 2 weeks of feeling sick every morning when I woke up thinking about doing this crazy thing to my life, I ended up thinking I'd regret not doing it more than I'd regret doing it. And so I said yes. So we ran a campaign for 4 months and built a community of about 900 volunteers in that time. And I discovered that really it wasn't just me or just this group. There was a broad sense of frustration with politics as we saw it, and a sense that the major parties were very focused on winning the next election rather than thinking about the long-term change that we need to build the country that we want. And so I was successful in winning that seat. And why did I run as an independent? I feel like the major parties are failing to deliver, and I find the party discipline an extraordinary thing where people can't speak up about what they think in public, and I think having independent voices in there who can say the hard stuff out loud and raise issues that neither of the parties are willing to deal with is a really positive development in our democracy.
Mm. And after being approached in 2022, you've just recently been elected for your second term as the member for Curtin. What was that process like, going through obviously the campaign and getting re-elected, and what sort of came from that?
Yeah, one of the things that I think has been really important to me is being willing to say the hard stuff out loud. And so often the major parties shy away from big issues because they're going to be electorally unpopular, and it's all focused on, we've got to win these votes or those votes. And so coming into a campaign phase was a real challenge, saying, well, I've got to make sure I'm still being brave. We can't say, we can't talk about that because it might threaten my position. Ultimately, for me, being brave and being true to my values was more important to me than winning. I'm sure this won't be the last job that I have. I'll have other parts of my career in the future. I'm here because of the stuff that I want to change rather than because I want to be a politician forever. So that was one of the tensions in the campaign. But it was really fun in a lot of ways, and I think community-driven politics can be really fun because I'm passionate about the need to reconnect people with our political systems and processes and really make sure people feel excited about the fact that we have a democracy. And you might not always get what you want, but if you can see how your voice has combined with other voices to inform a decision, we're much more likely to accept the outcome. So creating those opportunities for people to be heard, listening, on the ground, door knocking 35,000 houses, and really understanding what's important to people in their lives is one of the opportunities you do get in a political campaign.
Oh, it's really nice to hear that we have such a passionate politician, because nowadays, like the Liberal parties, they can literally, as you said, all about winning the next election. So now moving on to some of your policies, what policies do you believe are most important to our local community of like Perth?
So one of the reasons I became involved in the first place was I felt really disappointed about the government's approach on climate and climate action. And I'm a mother of 3 who are 19, 17 and 14. And I felt like, what am I going to tell my kids in 50 years when they say, you knew what was happening, the whole world knew the damage that was being done, and yet you didn't do anything. And so that's an issue that I care deeply about. It's also, if I look at the 3 top issues that people write to me about, 2 of those are climate and environment. So it is something that matters deeply to people here in Curtin. And obviously taking action on climate requires action at a federal, state, local level and an individual level as well. So it's a huge shift, but it also provides so much opportunity for our economy. Now, we do have an economy that's very closely connected with fossil fuels at the moment, but we happen to be in this incredible position, especially here in WA, where we have all the resources that we need to thrive as the world moves to net zero. We have critical minerals, which we've been hearing more about in the last week, that are needed to make batteries and other important aspects. We also have sun and wind and a whole lot of space and experience with big infrastructure projects. We also have a history of bold thinking. So here in WA, we built a pipeline to Kalgoorlie 100 and whatever years ago, which unleashed the gold rush and this wave of prosperity. And that long-term thinking and bold decisions, creating enabling infrastructure for prosperity is part of our DNA. We did it again with iron ore and the Northwest Shelf, and we're now on the cusp of this next wave of economic prosperity. And there's so much opportunity, and we just have to be bold and be forward-looking, as we have been in the last 150 years. We've been pretty good at that, to make the most of the opportunities that we have in the industries for which there will be global demand in the coming decades. So that really excites me. And I think here in Curtin, people are thinkers. We've got a really highly educated population here. And one of the things that I find really inspiring is that constituents are willing to think long term and willing to think about what's good for the country and where the jobs for our kids and grandkids are going to come from, rather than whether they've got $5 more in their pocket at the next election.
And you talk about net zero and renewable resources, wind, water, sun. Are there any policies or stages in place in Parliament that are looking towards that, or is this something we're looking to in the future to bring into parliamentary?
Well, we're actually well down the path of a shift to renewable energy, and in our grid here in Perth, it's more than 30% renewable now. So we're all already well and truly doing that. This government has various things in place that it is hoping will unleash and accelerate that transition. And they're working, to varying degrees of success. But we've got the National Reconstruction Fund, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, ARENA. There are structures there that are designed to crowd in private capital. The reality is that most of the capital that's needed to transition our economy will come from the private sector, and there are private sector investors who are willing to invest in shifting to this lower cost of energy in renewables. But what they need is policy certainty. So a big part of the federal government's role is to make it clear that, yes, we aren't going to be left behind. We are going to shift to a net zero economy and give that certainty, and then use targeted investment to crowd in private capital so that we're de-risking some of that initial transition stuff, because countries all over the world are investing heavily in this area. So we're not competing. It's not a level playing field, and we have to make sure that we're also being bold and showing that we do want to be part of the economy that will be around in 10, 20, 30 years' time.
Well, it's awesome to see that we have such great investment going into renewable energy sources. Now, I'd like to move on to the cost of living relief policies that you're putting in place, because obviously there's a housing crisis in Victoria, and there is one here as well, but it isn't as bad. But I'm curious to see what's going to be happening like 10 years down the line in terms of housing crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it is pretty bad here. And when I'm door knocking, I speak to lots of people who say, well, it's all right for me, I've got this house, but I worry for my kids and grandkids. And we have this issue with housing where over the last 25 years, housing has got really unaffordable. So when I bought my first house in 1999, the average house was about 4 times the average income, the median income. It's now 9 times. So over 25 years, policy from both sides of government has driven house prices up relative to wages. And I think politically you can see how that happens, because 2/3 of households are owned, and the people who own their houses love it when the value of their house goes up because they feel richer. Successive governments of both sides have realised that they're popular when house prices go up. Now, for the third of households that are not owned, that's really bad news, and it gets more and more out of reach. And so part of that is tax treatment, but there are a whole lot of factors, and there isn't one silver bullet on how we address that. I have had a couple of community events around housing and put together a housing policy that identifies 15 different things that we need to do to address that. I wish there was one simple answer, but there isn't. Some of that is about supply. A big problem is we just actually need more places for people to live. And that comes down to these complex interrelationships between federal, state and local government, planning and approval processes, the release of land and being able to churn out some more supply. But there are a whole lot of other factors too. Government invests a whole lot less in social housing than it used to. So in 1982, 14 of every 100 housing approvals was for public housing. It's now 1.7. So it's massively decreased. So government does have a role to play. And last time we had a big housing crisis after the Second World War, the government played a role in building more houses. So I do think government's got something to do there. Tax treatment is another issue that is important, and that's about shifting people from renting to owning. So we have capital gains tax and negative gearing regimes. Since 2000, the way they've interacted, it's been easier to be an investor in housing than to buy a place to own. And that has real implications for people in their 20s who come and see me and say, both of us have good jobs, we're working hard, and we can't save enough we can't afford to buy our own house. And every generation before has believed that the next generation will be better off, but that's no longer something that we can confidently say. And so shifting capital gains tax or negative gearing so that it's actually easier to buy a home than it is to buy an investment property is something that neither party really wants to deal with, but I think it absolutely has to be on the table as part of broader tax reform to make sure that we're addressing the intergenerational inequity that we're seeing in our society today, and which no doubt you guys would hear about.
I think after hearing that, I might have to wait a bit longer to buy a house now.
I'm really sorry. Unfortunately, in Australia at the moment, unless you've got the bank of mum and dad to call on, it's very, very challenging. And while many people do, and lucky them, it does feel like it's not fair if living in Australia you can't expect to buy somewhere that to live in unless you've actually got parents who were lucky enough to also have that wealth to hand on. So I feel that feels like a fundamental part of fairness in Australia that we're failing on at the moment.
And recently you've become a big advocate for the reduction of gambling. So what are you doing to control and reduce the problem of gambling that we're having in WA and Australia?
So I sat on a committee that did an inquiry into online gambling about 3 years ago at the beginning of my first term. And it was a fantastic process. It was my first parliamentary committee, and I thought, this is great. This is how Parliament should work. It was people from across the political spectrum, MPs getting together, saying, what do we need to do in this area? We heard 45 hours of evidence and came up with 31 recommendations that we handed to the government. The government has failed to implement any of them or even respond to the report, which I think is not okay. One of those recommendations was getting rid of ads for online gambling, just like we did with tobacco a generation ago. And online gambling creates all these social problems. I've spoken to parents, more often parents of young men, including young men from this school, whose kids have experienced real harm from gambling, but there's so much shame about it that people don't speak about it out loud. And the gambling companies are really good at normalising gambling as part of sport. So there's this sense that if you love sport, then you have a punt. And kids, young people, no doubt your friends can talk about the odds on a game, and this has become a normalised part of how we appreciate sport. That's really, really clever by the gambling companies, because they are grooming a generation of people who will be their customers in the future. And the reality is most of their profits come from a very small number of people. And if you experience problems with gambling, it's like any other addiction, and it's not a fair fight, because these gambling companies have 200 pieces of information about every customer that they have, and they use that to target you at your most vulnerable and get you to spend as much money as possible. So I think there's broad community support. Surveys show 75% of people say we should get rid of the gambling ads like we did with tobacco ads. But unfortunately, the money and the power speaks. So the gambling companies make big donations to the political parties, $1.7 million last year. The media companies who write the stories about the politicians don't want to lose their gambling revenue, so the politicians are very nervous about that too. And the sports codes benefit a lot as well. The AFL gets 3 different revenue streams from the gambling industry. They get direct sponsorships, they get inflated broadcast rights because the TV stations can sell gambling ad time, and they also get a cut every time someone makes a bet on a game of footy. So that's, I think, why the government is not doing what the community wants to do and take action on this, because we're seeing money and power get in the way of the government acting in the public interest. So I'm still putting a lot of pressure on the government, as are a lot of gambling advocates. We're not talking about banning gambling. We're just talking about getting rid of the ads so you can watch a game of sport on telly without being bombarded the whole time. I'm really interested in what you guys think about that issue too.
I was just about to say, so gambling seems to be, especially on like Sportsbet and all those sports betting apps, it's ingrained in the culture, especially around a lot of people I hang out with. I don't gamble myself, but I was just wondering, is there anything else we can do as well as stopping advertisements? Because it's such an ingrained part of watching sport. I feel like stopping advertisements, it'll work, but it'll still be there.
Yeah, there are 31 recommendations in the report, and that's just one of them. So there is a whole lot of other stuff we can do too. The reason we've picked that as the thing to start with is because that's the thing that normalises it and makes it so much part of the culture that if you're talking about footy, you're also talking about the odds. The report also recommended having a national regulator. So there's one body that regulates nationally all the gambling companies. At the moment, they're all based in the Northern Territory because that has the weakest regulation. And it means that there's just some appalling behaviour. People being incentivised, so people who work for gambling companies being incentivised to maximise people's losses by being paid on commissions, and inducements that that's where they send messages to existing customers saying, if you bet today, we'll give you a free $500 that you can gamble with. And what the evidence shows is that actually drives riskier behaviour and bigger bets and riskier behaviour. So there are all these patterns in the gambling industry that really need to be addressed as part of an overall perspective, as well as bit more community education and support services as well. There are 31 recommendations. I'd like to see them all implemented, or at least for the government to come out and say, this is our response to them. We're going to do these and we aren't going to do these, but we haven't even had that yet.
And you discussed taking a similar approach to tobacco and cigarettes, where we took away the advertising almost completely. Could there be an approach similar to the way we did with tobacco, where we have advertisement, we have the packaging, however, it's showing the negative effects as opposed to just the product itself? Is that a path that we could look to taking to help reduce this problem?
Yeah, I think there is a lot we can learn from tobacco, and that took time, and there was a lot of resistance from the industry, and we're seeing all the same resistance tactics coming from the gambling companies as we did from the tobacco companies a generation ago. For example, saying there's not enough research, you can't prove it, or it's up to the individual to make the decisions. So even the tagline you see, gamble responsibly, if you think about those words, the first word is gamble. It's saying go and gamble. And responsibly implies if you're experiencing problems, it's your fault. You're not being responsible. And tobacco tried the same things. What we saw with tobacco is eventually we got to the complete ban on advertising, and then also had plain packaging guidelines or different messaging. And for example, I'd like to see, in order to so I get the TV companies are saying we're going to lose ad revenue if you ban gambling ads. Well, the government could charge a levy on each bet, and then use that money to actually pay the TV companies to buy that advertising space, and instead use it for responsible, messages around what gambling harm looks like, and to try and address some of the stigma and shame around it. So lots of different lessons from there. We're also seeing, similar to tobacco, insidious lobbying in different ways. So, for example, the gambling industry are a client of what's a listed lobbying organisation, the Australian Parliamentary Sports Club, that runs sports events in the morning. And it's good fun. People go down there, but there are gambling lobbyists in there talking to the parliamentarians and building those relationships. And when David Pocock, who's an active member of the Parliamentary Sports Club, as you can imagine, when he drew attention to that, they kicked him out of the Parliamentary Sports Club, which just shows where the power lies and how deep and insidious these connections are. And I hear from people here in Curtin who may not be aligned with me on many of the other things I'm working on, but they say, keep up the good work on gambling, because there is really broad community support for a change there.
So we have this big problem with gambling in the sports industry, but how about like old school gambling? So down like the casino and things like that. I don't see much advertisement for gambling. Is that still a big problem in our community?
Oh, look, my focus has been in the online space, because I think that's the growing area, and that's where it's available 24/7 in your pocket. You can be at home on the couch, and it's really hard to get away from it. There are obviously still issues with location-based gambling. In WA, we've made the really good decision not to have pokies in pubs and clubs, and I think we should be really proud of that and hold tight to it. So my focus is less on going to the casino, because you have to choose to go there, make an event of it. I'm not saying it's all perfect, but I'm not anti-gambling full stop. It's more that if you're experiencing problems with gambling and you have an addiction, it's really hard to avoid it, especially when you're being bombarded. So we heard from one guy who had self-excluded himself from 100 different gambling sites, and he was still being targeted online with ads from new gambling companies, because they knew he was a valuable customer, because he lost his life savings if they could get him in there. So it's that insidious, hidden, always available type of gambling that I think is the biggest risk, and it's the biggest growth area in gambling too.
And before, when we were walking down here, you discussed in the House of Representatives how there was a weak coalition and how the side bench is a lot stronger at the moment than we've seen in previous terms. Could the coalition not looking into things like these 31 examples of trying to reduce gambling. Could that be because of a weak coalition, or are there other factors that come into play with that?
Yeah, so I don't think that's quite what I said. I did say that I thought the crossbench still had a really important role to play, and with a big Labor majority, and the coalition obviously has some issues internally, it's really important that we have voices holding government to account, also holding coalition to account, that they haven't been that vocal on gambling either. And really to speak for community rather than political interests. Now, I've had people in the coalition say to me, keep up the good work on gambling. I can't speak up within the party, they're a donor. That's the reality of the way the major political parties work, unfortunately. So I think, continue as the crossbench's role really is to say the hard bits out loud that the major parties don't want to deal with, but there is broad community support for addressing. And I think that will continue in this parliament. I'll keep putting pressure on the government to respond to that. Now, gambling is not the biggest problem we have in Australia. There are massive issues that we need to deal with. But I think this is a really good example where the party system is getting in the way of government actually doing what the community wants. And because people in the major parties have to put the party interests before the interests of their community or even the interests of the country, we're not getting any action on it. So I'll keep calling those sorts of things out.
So just moving on to what you were saying about the crossbench being the most vocal part of Parliament, the Labor Party has the absolute majority at the moment. What has the crossbench been able to do to influence legislation passed in the House of Representatives at the moment?
Yeah, well, in the last Parliament, you often hear, but what can the crossbench actually do? In the last Parliament, the crossbench successfully amended 20 pieces of legislation, and the opposition successfully got amendments up to one piece of legislation. So if you're working collaboratively and constructively and you're raising problems, finding solutions, there is some willingness to listen to that. Sometimes it's harder to draw a direct line. Obviously, when an amendment is put up and agreed to by the government, that's a really obvious KPI, but also behind the scenes too. So, for example, on the superannuation tax breaks for balances above $3 million, when the government originally said that they were going to cut down the tax breaks above $3 million, my view was, look, I can see the purpose of the legislation. That makes sense. This is for superannuation. It's not for wealth management. But it's done really badly by taxing unrealised gains. So people might have to pay tax when they haven't actually got the cash. They haven't earned the cash from their investments yet to pay it. And it's not indexed, so that will creep up over years. We should be indexing tax brackets generally. So there were some issues with the policy. Now, the government said, no, we're going to go ahead, or they didn't, and they've just recently walked that back and said we won't tax unrealised gains and we will index that amount. They didn't say because the crossbench made us, but that's fine. I understand I'm part of a system and we are able to make some changes. The other thing that's happened in the last week, when the government introduced legislation in the last term about capping international student numbers and improving the quality of education providers so that we're not getting sort of sham students who just want to get in on another visa. I put an amendment saying separate it. There are real problems with the international student caps because it has all these other implications, but we do need to do this stuff about improving the quality of the providers. Well, the government in the last week has introduced legislation which just does the good bit and doesn't do the more controversial bit. So speaking up on these issues, getting them in the public eye, it contributes to putting pressure on the government to make those changes, and I think that will continue to be the case.
Well, thank you for coming in today. It's been really interesting to both of us to hear about your insights in local parliament and then your work in the House of Representatives and gambling and all that. So thank you.
Thank you. And can I say it is really exciting to have young people like you guys engaged in politics, because my biggest fear is disengagement, is that people lose trust that this democracy belongs to them. And so it's so important that younger people feel a sense that this is your system and you are allowed to be curious about it and you're allowed to question what you see and continue to push the things that you think are important. So well done to you.